My brother's wedding was a total disaster. Then he stole, lied, and tried to ruin my life. But I got the last word, and I grew up in a family where drama wasn't just an occasional storm. It was the constant weather. My parents, Linda and Robert, thrived on it. My relatives fueled it. And my younger brother, Jordan, somehow always managed to be at the center of it. Meanwhile, I had spent most of my life as the neutral one, the guy who stayed out of the mess. That is, until Jordan's wedding disaster pulled me in, whether I liked it or not. Jordan had been with Emily for years. From the outside, they seemed like a normal couple, but anyone paying attention could see the cracks. Their relationship was a revolving door of breakups and makeups, full of heated arguments followed by extravagant apologies. Emily, in particular, looked more exhausted than excited whenever the wedding came up. It was like she was forcing herself to go through the motions. I had my suspicions that she was second-guessing the entire thing, but I kept my thoughts to myself. My parents had made it clear that Jordan's relationship was his own business. Their unspoken rule was simple: stay out of it, unless you're helping clean up the mess. The wedding, though, had become their latest obsession. A grand, over-the-top affair with an extravagant venue, a ridiculous guest list, and an absurd budget. They were pulling every string to make sure this was the most talked-about event of the year. My input was never asked for, which I didn't mind, since it meant I wasn't expected to take on any responsibility. But I should have known that no matter how much I tried to stay out of it, trouble always had a way of finding me. A few weeks before the wedding, Emily pulled me aside. It wasn't casual. She looked stressed, nervous, like she was about to say something she wasn't sure she should. We met at a quiet bar away from where my parents or Jordan would ever think to look. She kept glancing around like she was afraid someone was watching. Then, she dropped a bombshell. Jordan had a gambling problem. Not just casual bets here and there, but real, serious debt. He had been losing big, covering his losses with more reckless bets, sinking deeper and deeper. And the worst part? He had taken out a loan in her name without her knowledge. I didn't even react with shock. I had always known Jordan was reckless with money. He relied on our parents to bail him out whenever he screwed up, and they always did. But this was different. This wasn't just bad decisions. This was fraud. Emily wasn't just angry. She was scared. She told me she had already confronted him, but he brushed it off, told her he had it under control. He promised her he'd fix everything after the wedding, but she didn't believe him anymore. And honestly, neither did I. I should have gone straight to my parents with this, but I already knew how that conversation would go. Every time I had tried to warn them about Jordan's behavior in the past, they had shut me down. "That's just Jordan," they'd say, as if that excused everything. No, I knew better than to waste my breath on them. Instead, I went straight to Jordan. I didn't ambush him or come at him aggressively. I simply asked him, calmly, what was going on. He laughed it off at first, called Emily dramatic, said she was exaggerating. But I didn't let it go. The moment I pushed, his entire demeanor changed. He got defensive, his voice sharpened, and he told me to stay in my lane. Reminded me that I was always the one who never got involved in family issues. So why start now? I looked him in the eyes, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. He was in deep, and he knew it. But he wasn't going to admit it. At the rehearsal dinner, Emily looked miserable. She barely touched her food, barely spoke. Just sat there looking like a woman trapped in a nightmare. My parents, of course, were too busy entertaining guests to notice. I kept an eye on her, and at one point, she pulled me aside again. "I don't think I can do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. I told her she had to make a decision soon. The wedding was right around the corner. If she was going to back out, she needed to do it now. She nodded, hesitating. "Just don't say anything yet, please." I agreed, but I felt like I was watching a car crash in slow motion. If I warned my parents, they would be furious. If I stayed quiet, I'd be complicit. Either way, this was going to explode. And explode it did. The morning of the wedding, everything fell apart. Emily was gone. She left a message with one of her bridesmaids. She couldn't go through with it. She wasn't coming. Jordan lost it. He locked himself in his hotel room, refusing to come out. My parents went into full crisis mode, but not in the way a normal family would. They didn't wonder what had gone wrong in Jordan's relationship. They didn't try to check on his well-being. Instead, they turned to me. You knew, didn't you? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I barely had time to react before they launched into me, furious that I hadn't done something to stop this. Apparently, being neutral no longer applied when it was inconvenient for them. Jordan refused to talk to anyone for days. My parents, rather than focusing on him, called me non-stop to complain. Not about Jordan's actions, not about his gambling, not about the loan he took in Emily's name. No, they were too busy mourning the non-refundable deposits, the embarrassment, the social humiliation. It was never about what Jordan had done. It was about how it made them look. And when they needed someone to blame, and Emily wasn't around anymore, they turned to me. That was when I realized there was no winning with them. If I had warned them, they would have accused me of meddling. Since I didn't, I was guilty of letting it happen. No matter what, I was the scapegoat. And once that accusation was out there, the damage was done. The family group chat went quiet for a little while, a short-lived peace. Then, the flood of messages started again. The narrative had shifted. If Emily was brave enough to speak out about Jordan's gambling, then clearly, someone had put her up to it. And in their eyes, that someone was me. Because in this family, accountability wasn't an option. It didn't even make sense, but logic didn't matter. Most of the family sided with my parents. A few cousins messaged me privately, saying they thought I had done the right thing by staying out of it. But none of them said it in the group. Nobody wanted to get involved. Meanwhile, Jordan was still trying to get Emily back. He was calling, texting, trying to convince her to meet up and talk things through. She wasn't responding. That was when my parents got desperate. They gave me an ultimatum. Apologize to Jordan and make things right, my father said, or consider yourself cut off from this family. I told them to do whatever they needed to do. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of their threats. The day after my parents' ultimatum, I thought maybe things would start settling down. I was wrong. A few days later, my mom reached out, saying she wanted to have a calm conversation, just to put everything behind us. She asked me to come over, promising it wasn't an ambush, just a talk. I should have known better. The second I walked into my parents' house, I realized I had been set up. My dad was pacing in the living room. My mom sat on the couch, pretending to wipe away non-existent tears. And Jordan? He sat there with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. A couple of aunts and one of my uncles were there too, which meant this wasn't just a family discussion. This was an intervention. I sat down, waiting for them to start. My mother spoke first. Nathan, we just want to fix this. She said it like this was a misunderstanding, like Jordan hadn't been the one to cause all of this. Then Jordan leaned forward, his voice all smooth and forgiving. Look, man, I get it. You were just trying to help, but you made things worse. You let Emily get into your head, and you let her ruin everything. He paused, giving me that smug look that had always driven me insane. But I forgive you. I laughed. I couldn't help it. You forgive me? My father scowled. Don't be disrespectful, Nathan. This is serious. I looked at my mom. What exactly do you want from me? She sniffled, her voice soft. We want you to help Jordan. He's lost right now. He needs his brother. There it was. The same excuse they had used for him my whole life. Jordan was lost. Jordan just needed help. I folded my arms. How am I supposed to help him? Jordan shrugged, looking down at his hands as if he was hesitant to ask. Emily won't answer my calls. She blocked me. I need you to talk to her, man. Tell her I'm willing to work things out. I stared at him. You stole from her, Jordan. She doesn't want to work things out. My mother grabbed my hand. Nathan, honey, you've always been the responsible one. She'll listen to you. Just get her to meet with him. One conversation. That's all. I shook my head. That's not happening. That's when the guilt-tripping started. My mom went on and on about how I didn't understand what it was like to be a mother, how it broke her heart to see Jordan struggling. My dad reminded me how many times they had supported me growing up, how Jordan had always looked up to me. You're his older brother, Nathan. Set an example. I wasn't budging. I had spent years cleaning up Jordan's messes, taking the blame for things I didn't do, being the one expected to keep the family together while he ran wild. Not this time. Then the switch flipped. My parents stopped begging and started blaming. My dad's voice turned sharp. You did turn her against him, didn't you? She wouldn't have left if you hadn't gotten involved. I stood up. She left because she finally realized who she was marrying. Jordan's face twisted in anger. You always thought you were better than me. I didn't reply. There was no point. I turned and walked out, ignoring my mother's desperate calls for me to stay. By the time I got home, the family group chat was on fire. My name was being dragged through the mud. My parents had gone on a full-blown campaign, calling relatives, telling them I had abandoned my brother in his time of need. Some cousins messaged me privately, saying they didn't believe the things being said about me, but they weren't defending me publicly either. Nobody wanted to take sides. Then Jordan messaged me directly. Jordan, I'm rebuilding my life, man. I just need a little help. Translation? He wanted money. I ignored it. A few hours later, another message. Jordan, you're really gonna do this? After everything? You're just like Emily. Selfish. Heartless. Then the final threat. Jordan, if you don't help me, don't ever bother speaking to me again. I stared at the message for a long moment. That was supposed to scare me, but instead, I just felt relief. If he never spoke to me again, that would be the best thing that had ever happened. I blocked his number. That didn't stop my parents. They picked up where Jordan left off, sending me long dramatic texts, saying I was tearing the family apart. The family group chat was still filled with their nonsense, calling me selfish, ungrateful, a disgrace. Then it spilled into my workplace. One of my cousins, someone I barely spoke to, worked in the same company as me. He cornered me in the break room, pretending to check in. It didn't take long before he started pressing me about Jordan. The family's really hurt by what you're doing, he said, trying to sound casual. I didn't take the bait. I just grabbed my coffee and left. Later that day, I overheard him talking to a few coworkers, twisting the story in Jordan's favor. I had to have a private conversation with my manager just to get ahead of any rumors. A few days later, things escalated even further. My parents showed up at my house. They banged on my door, calling my name, refusing to leave. My phone was already blowing up with messages from relatives. Word had spread that my parents were making a last attempt to talk to me. I didn't let them in. They stood outside for nearly half an hour, alternating between begging and demanding. My mom cried, saying we needed to fix this as a family. My dad accused me of abandoning the people who had always supported me. Then came the final guilt trip. We raised you, my mom sobbed, and this is how you treat us? You're his brother, my dad shouted. Family doesn't turn their backs on each other. I finally opened the door, just enough to look them in the eyes. I'm done. My mom's face crumbled. My dad's turned red with rage. No more phone calls. No more messages, I said. I'm going no contact. They tried to argue, but I didn't give them the chance. I shut the door and locked it. That night, I struggled with it. Cutting off family isn't easy, no matter how toxic they are. But I knew this was the only way to break free. If I stayed, they'd keep dragging me down, expecting me to clean up Jordan's messes for the rest of my life. A week later, Emily reached out. She had heard about what happened. I just wanted to say thank you, she told me, for standing your ground. Meanwhile, Jordan was spiraling. Word got around that he was in serious financial trouble. His gambling hadn't stopped. It had gotten worse. He had borrowed money from multiple family members, promising to pay them back. Nobody had seen a dime. And my parents? They were still making excuses for him. But something had shifted. Some of my relatives were starting to see through the lies. For the first time, cracks were forming in the story my parents had so carefully crafted. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't part of their chaos anymore. I thought cutting off my parents and Jordan would bring some peace. For a little while, it almost did. The silence was unsettling at first, like I was waiting for the next storm to hit. But I kept reminding myself that this was what freedom looked like. No more late-night phone calls demanding that I fixed things. No more guilt trips. No more being dragged into problems that weren't mine. I started sleeping better. Work got easier without constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next piece of drama to explode in my face. But my family wasn't done with me. A month after I cut contact, my parents switched tactics. Since I wasn't answering their calls or messages, they started reaching out to my friends and coworkers. I started getting random messages from people asking if everything was okay. Some were confused. Some were concerned. Some just straight up told me, "Hey, your parents called me. They said you abandoned them in Jordan. What's going on?" It was embarrassing. I had worked so hard to keep my personal life separate from my professional one, but my parents had no boundaries. They didn't care if they were making me look bad. They just wanted control. Then they went to Facebook. They started posting vague, passive-aggressive statuses about ungrateful children and how some people forget where they come from. They never named me, but anyone who knew the situation could put two and two together. Some of my relatives liked the posts. Some commented with sympathy. Others stayed silent. I ignored it. Then I got a message from one of my aunts. She had always been quieter in the family drama, never outright taking sides. But this time, she had something to say. "I just want you to know that I support you," she wrote. "Jordan has always been reckless. Your parents have always enabled him. I'm not going to say anything publicly, but I don't blame you for walking away." It wasn't much, but it was the first real validation I had gotten from within the family. Then Jordan did something even more insane. He tried to sue Emily. Apparently, he had convinced himself that she had humiliated him and caused emotional distress by leaving him at the altar. It was a pathetic attempt at a quick payout, probably a last-ditch effort to cover some of his debts. But Emily wasn't playing games. She got a lawyer immediately. She wasn't backing down. That was when Jordan completely lost it. He posted a long, dramatic Facebook rant about how Emily and I had ruined his life. He made himself sound like a victim, talking about how he had given everything to that relationship, how he had been betrayed by the two people who were supposed to have his back the most. Of course, he left out the part where he stole from her. The comments section was a disaster. Some people believed him. Some people called him out. Others just asked for more details, probably hoping for more gossip. And my parents? They were in the comments too, backing him up, talking about how certain people in the family had turned their backs on him. It was pathetic. That was my breaking point. I finally realized that there was no fixing this. My family had picked their side, and it wasn't mine. Jordan wasn't going to change. My parents weren't going to take accountability. And as long as I stayed in their lives, I was going to be their scapegoat. I wasn't ready to go completely no contact with my extended family, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done playing their game. After Jordan's ridiculous lawsuit against Emily and his public meltdown on Facebook, I knew I had to start cutting ties more permanently. I blocked Jordan first. I didn't want to deal with his endless messages, his manipulative guilt trips, or his last-minute attempts at forgiveness. Then I went low contact with my parents. I didn't block them yet, but I stopped responding to most of their calls and texts. I knew what was coming. The constant pressure to fix things, the emotional manipulation, the guilt tripping. Sure enough, the moment Jordan realized I had cut him off, my parents picked up where he left off. My mom started sending long, dramatic paragraphs about how Jordan was falling apart and how it was my responsibility to help him. My dad took a more aggressive approach, short messages filled with disappointment. "Family never turns their backs on each other," he wrote, over and over again. The family group chat didn't slow down either. The smear campaign was in full swing. My name kept coming up. Selfish, ungrateful, heartless. Some relatives messaged me privately saying they didn't agree with how my parents were handling things, but they wouldn't say anything publicly. Nobody wanted to get involved. Then it spilled into real life again. I was at work, trying to focus, when I noticed someone watching me from across the office. It was my cousin, the same one who had tried cornering me in the break room before. He walked over, all fake concern. "Hey man, the family's still really upset. You know, it wouldn't kill you to just apologize. Maybe meet Jordan halfway?" I wasn't interested in hearing his take on things. "I'm done talking about this." He wasn't subtle. He was fishing for information, trying to see if I would break and admit something they could use against me. I shut it down and walked away. Later that day, I overheard him talking to some coworkers, clearly trying to spin the situation in Jordan's favor. I had to schedule another private meeting with my manager just to get ahead of any rumors. Luckily, my boss didn't care about my family drama as long as it didn't affect my work. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, my parents showed up at my house again. This time, they weren't just knocking. They were pounding on the door. My phone was already lighting up with messages from relatives. Apparently, word had spread that my parents were making one last attempt to talk some sense into me. I didn't let them in. They stood outside for nearly half an hour, alternating between begging and demanding. My mom cried, saying we needed to fix this as a family. My dad accused me of turning my back on them, of abandoning the people who had always supported me. Then came the final guilt trip. My mom's voice broke as she said, "You don't understand, Nathan. You don't know what it's like to be a mother. Watching your child suffer. It's unbearable." My dad's tone turned sharp. "Do you think you're better than us? Do you think you're better than Jordan?" I finally opened the door, just enough to look them in the eyes. "I'm done." My mom's face crumbled. My dad's turned red with rage. "No more phone calls. No more messages," I said. "I'm going no contact." They tried to argue, but I didn't give them the chance. I shut the door and locked it. That night, I struggled with it. Cutting off family isn't easy, no matter how toxic they are. But I knew this was the only way to break free. If I stayed, they'd keep dragging me down, expecting me to clean up Jordan's messes for the rest of my life. A week later, I got a call from a cousin. "Jordan's worse than ever," he said. "His gambling is completely out of control." It didn't surprise me. "He's been borrowing money from people in the family," my cousin continued. "But no one's seen a dime back. Even my parents were struggling to cover for him now." I should have felt bad, but I didn't. For the first time in my life, I wasn't part of their chaos anymore. A week after I told my parents I was done, I thought I'd finally found some peace. No more calls. No more guilt trips. No more being dragged into their mess. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Jordan wasn't the kind of person to accept consequences, and my parents had never been the type to let things go. It didn't take long for things to spiral. Jordan's gambling had reached a breaking point. He had borrowed money from almost everyone in the family, promising to pay them back as soon as he got back on his feet. Nobody had seen a dime. Word started spreading that he was thousands of dollars in debt, but instead of stopping, he got more desperate. My parents, of course, kept making excuses for him. "He's just having a rough time," they told people. "We all need to be patient with him." But even some of our relatives, people who had blindly supported Jordan for years, were starting to see the truth. Then my parents reached out again. I ignored their messages at first, but then they left a voicemail. My mom's voice was shaky, full of forced emotion. "Nathan, Jordan is in crisis. This is when family needs to come together. If you have any heart left, you'll step up and do something." I didn't respond. Then, one night, my phone rang. It was past midnight. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something in my gut told me who it was before I even answered. Jordan. His voice was slurred, his words barely making sense. You ruined everything," he muttered. "You and Emily. You poisoned everyone against me." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "Jordan, you're drunk. Go sleep it off." But he wasn't done. His words got angrier, more aggressive. "You turned them against me. You took my family away from me." Then his voice dropped, cold and dangerous. "I'm coming over. We're going to talk about this, whether you like it or not." I didn't wait to see if he was serious. I called the police. By the time they showed up, Jordan was outside my place, pounding on my door. He was still rambling, still blaming me for everything. When the cops arrived, he tried to play it off, acting like he was just here for a friendly conversation. It didn't work. They took him away. The next day, my parents lost it. My mom left me a voicemail, her voice shaking with rage. "You called the police on your own brother? He needed you, Nathan, and you threw him to the wolves." They made it sound like I had sent him to prison instead of stopping a drunk, angry man from breaking into my house. It didn't matter to them that Jordan was the one making threats, that I had no reason to let him in, that he had put himself in this situation. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Emily reached out. "Jordan is trying to contest the fraud charges," she told me. "He's claiming he never took out the loan in my name, that I agreed to it, that I'm just trying to ruin his life." She wasn't backing down, though. She had a lawyer, and she was ready to fight. But Jordan? He was already looking for his next escape. "He's trying to fix his reputation," Emily said. "I heard he's already looking for someone new to date." He's telling people his ex-fiancée destroyed him, that his family betrayed him, that he just needs someone to stand by him. It was so predictable, I almost laughed. Jordan wasn't learning. He wasn't changing. He was just looking for his next victim. Meanwhile, my parents weren't giving up on dragging me back in. Since I wasn't responding to them anymore, they tried a new approach, reaching out to my friends, my coworkers, anyone who might pressure me into talking to them. I started getting messages from people asking if I was okay, saying my parents had contacted them, talking about how I had turned my back on the family. Then they went back to Facebook. More passive-aggressive posts. More fake sadness about losing a child who refuses to forgive. And then, out of nowhere, I got another message. But this time, it wasn't from my parents. It was from my aunt, the same one who had quietly supported me before. She had finally had enough. She told them she was done. She was tired of the excuses, tired of the endless enabling, tired of watching them blame everyone except Jordan. She wasn't making a big announcement about it, but she wanted me to know I wasn't alone. More and more family members were starting to pull away. And for the first time, my parents were losing control. After my aunt cut ties with my parents, I thought things might finally slow down. But my family had always been predictable in the worst ways. When they felt like they were losing control, they got desperate. And desperate people do stupid things. Jordan started showing up at places Emily was known to go, pretending it was all just coincidence. He started calling from different numbers, leaving long, rambling voicemails. When she blocked those, he sent messages through mutual friends, trying to get her to talk. She was done playing games. She got a restraining order. At the same time, I was realizing that no matter how much distance I put between myself and my family, they weren't going to stop. Every time I ignored them, they just found a new way to insert themselves into my life. That was when I made my decision. I was going to move. A new city, a new place, somewhere they couldn't just show up whenever they felt like it. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even the few family members who had quietly supported me. I packed up my life and left without looking back. Right before I left, my parents made one last attempt. They sent me a long email, carefully written, playing every emotional angle they could think of. They begged me to fix things before it was too late. They said if I truly loved my family, I wouldn't walk away. I never responded. Then I got a call from a former family friend, someone who had distanced themselves from the chaos but still kept tabs on everything. Jordan hit rock bottom, they told me. He's in serious trouble. The gambling hadn't stopped, it had gotten worse. With no one left to bail him out, he was taking bigger risks, borrowing money from people who weren't just going to send polite reminders when debts weren't paid. My parents were scrambling. More and more relatives had started seeing through their lies. Their version of the story, Jordan was just unlucky, and I was a traitor for walking away, was falling apart. Then Jordan made his biggest mistake. He got arrested. He had been using stolen credit card information to cover his losses. The authorities had warned him before, but this time, there was no way out. And my parents? They expected me to fix it. This time, they didn't beg. They demanded. They left me voicemails saying I needed to step up and bail Jordan out. That no matter what had happened before, family doesn't let family rot in jail. I ignored it. Then the extended family got involved. My parents must have gone on another campaign, because suddenly, I was the villain again. The messages flooded in. How could you let your own brother go to jail? No matter what he did, he's still your blood. But something was different this time. More and more people were cutting my parents off. The cousins who had stayed neutral for the longest time finally saw the truth. My parents had spent years enabling Jordan, shifting blame, demanding loyalty while never holding him accountable. Now, they were running out of people to manipulate. Then came the most insane move yet. They tried to sue me for emotional distress. I couldn't believe it when I saw the legal notice. It was a pathetic attempt, a last-ditch effort to scare me into helping them. It went nowhere. A lawyer took one look at it and told me it was nonsense. And while they were busy wasting their time with that, their own financial situation collapsed. The wedding expenses, Jordan's debts, the legal fees, it all added up. They had to sell their house. And of course, they blamed me. In their minds, if I had just been a good son, if I had just helped when I was supposed to, none of this would have happened. But here's the thing. The moment they sold the house, the harassment slowed down. Maybe they were too busy with their own problems. Maybe they finally realized I wasn't going to budge. Whatever the reason, it didn't matter.